Minute. All right, my name is Ron Sanders. I'm a senior executive advisor and fellow with Booz Allen Hamilton. And I think in part the reason I'm standing up here is that I've got a lot of scars and bruises from the budget wars of the 90s and helped put together a report that provides some of the lessons learned from that period. Most recently I was Chief Human Capital Officer for the intelligence community. Before that, Associate Director at OPM. Before that, Chief HR Officer at IRS. Before that, Director of Civilian Personnel for Defense. That's about 2 decades worth. We'll stop and dispense with the introductions. So, at the risk of stating what was blindingly obvious even a year ago, as people began to see the dark clouds of budget cutting on the horizon, Booz Allen and the Partnership for Public Service got together and looked at the government landscape and said, you know, as in the words of that sage American philosopher Yogi Berra, this is deja vu all over again. This is kind of what we went through in the 90s. The circumstances are a little bit different. We're not going to spend a lot of time contrasting them because I think as a practical matter for folks on the front lines like yourselves, the antecedent conditions are less important. It's what's facing you now and in the next couple of years. And as we surveyed the landscape, we realized that a lot of the people that had gone through those cuts in the 90s, not just the 90s, we had cuts literally over the last couple of decades, but they were deepest in the decade of the 90s. In defense, we searched for the so-called peace dividend. Those words haven't been used yet, but kind of sort of what's going on in defense, right? And then concurrently, we decided we were going to reinvent government. And the federal government in total reduced by several 100,000, depending on how you count them, potentially as much as 400,000 civilian jobs, military even larger. And across government, we learned lots of hard lessons, and we tried to capture them in this report, Making Smart Cuts. What I'm going to do this morning is very, very briefly summarize that report. You have it on a CD in your chairs. And then focus on, in my humble opinion, what is the most important aspect of that report and some of the follow-on studies that we've done, and that is how to deal with the people side of this. Because at the risk, again, of telling you the blindingly obvious, most agency budgets are 80 to 85% personnel costs. Even DOD is probably close to 60% personnel costs. And when you think about your contract workforce, the percentage goes even higher. And I'm here to tell you, we ought to be thinking about the contract workforce because they bring critical skills and we ignore them at our peril. So we set out to interview folks who had been there and done that in the budget wars of the 90s. Former directors of OMB, Sean O'Keefe, former DOD comptroller, David Walker. I got interviewed 4 times in each of my separate jobs. I interviewed myself. Just kidding. It was really insightful interviews, too. 32 people who have been through those budget cuts in the 90s and then some. And we try to get some insight from them. This is hard to read. Again, you've got the CD. This summarizes the 8 strategies that we identified. These are not mutually exclusive. I'll talk about that as we go through. Across-the-board cuts, programmatic cuts, decreasing administrative costs. I'm going to save the one in the box there for a second. Consolidating functions, re-engineering, IT investments, outsourcing, or its evil twin, insourcing. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about them. In the report, we talk about the pros and cons, and even something like across-the-board cuts. In DOD, we used to call it salami slicing, but the partnership wouldn't let me use that term in the report. Even that has its place because it's safe, it's easy, it's almost too easy, and it's something that can handle small reductions. But when you do them over time, death by 1,000 pinpricks, you can hollow out an agency. Programmatic cuts is probably the preferred option, where you actually look at mission and priority and performance and cut those programs that aren't doing well and keep those that are. But you all know how hard that is because every program has a constituency both internally and externally. Here's the bottom line of all those strategies, and that's why we're here this morning. Because agency budgets are 80 to 85% personnel, every one of them affects people. You cut overhead, you cut training, that affects people. You flatten the organization, you reduce the supervisory ratio, or increase the supervisory ratio as we did in the 90s, that affects people. It affects career paths, it affects managers, it affects morale. We'll talk about all of those things. Every one of those strategies impacts people to greater or lesser extent. So when we talk about personnel reductions, I hesitate to identify that as a strategy. That's almost like it's an independent variable that you set out to cut personnel as a budget-saving strategy. And I know that we never do that, right? We always look at missions and functions and processes and other things and kind of let the chips fall where they may when it comes to personnel. I'm being facetious because we know that's the easiest target. And there are, quote, easy ways of reducing personnel, things that are entirely voluntary, like voluntary retirement, voluntary separation incentive pay, aka buyouts. Many agencies are going through that now. And guess what we're seeing? The long-awaited retirement tsunami, right? Retirements have surged close to 25% over the last several months. And if we're playing a numbers game, if the idea is to reduce the size of the federal workforce, that's a good thing, right? But what's the downside? Brain drain. All sorts of institutional knowledge going out the door. But it's the least disruptive, right? Who tends to leave when you use voluntary means, besides your most senior employees and all that institutional knowledge? Highly competent. Yes, it's an old HR adage that is unfortunately true, that your best people, your most marketable, the highest performing, the ones with the most critical skills are the ones that are the first to vote with their feet. If they don't see a future, if they see those same storm clouds, even in tight economic times, for example, I worry that the government's hemorrhaging STEM talent, scientific, technical, engineering, math. I've even added a second M to it, medical. The best people are the ones that have the most opportunity. So while voluntary means are the most benign way of doing this, they can have insidious effects. And I'm guilty of that in an historic way, because when we reduced the size of the civilian workforce in the Defense Department in the 90s, we made the deliberate decision in the short term, because the cuts were so severe, to just blow the whistle and let everybody out of the pool. We knew that in 5, 7, 10 years downstream, we would find ourselves at a deficit when it came to critical skills, but the numbers were just too severe. So there are techniques ranging from Vera VSIP to the R word, RIF, which has its place because it is the most surgical. And I know that sounds harsh. I don't mean it to be. We'll talk about some of the strategies as we go through, but again, it would be nice to say that personnel reductions are a dependent variable, that we're going to do all of these other things, and judge the effect on people as a dependent variable, but often personnel are the first things to be cut, and then we sort of re-engineer to fit, right? We've lost all these people, now we rearrange the deck chairs. And looking at all these strategies very quickly, 4 cross-cutting strategies. These are sort of vertical. 4 cross-cutting that applied in every case where you saw success or lack thereof. 1, you need senior leader involvement and vision. Senior leaders need to be involved and drive it. This has to be a mission thing. It can't be seen as a personnel thing, even if you're focusing on personnel reductions. Secondly, no one strategy works. They work best in combination, in an integrated way. In fact, one of the things we found is that agencies that relied on normal budget and planning processes to handle cuts of double-digit magnitude generally struggle, because those processes are typically incremental in nature. you can deal with a little bit more and a little bit less each year, but when it comes to fundamental double-digit cuts, normal processes don't work. You also have to have a long-term planning horizon. And again, I know that's second nature to agencies. Everyone's thinking 5 years downstream, right? Being facetious here. And at the risk of being indelicate, especially at the senior leadership level, what are our senior leaders focused on? Today and November. And you have to help senior leaders resist the temptation to make short-term decisions that seem painless now but have long-term consequences. Things like hiring freezes or trying to reduce purely by voluntary means. Lastly, you've got to have a change management strategy. This is all about fundamental change. And we'll talk about that. So those are the 8 strategies, but we're going to focus on the human capital dimension, making smart people cuts. And here are 5 questions that every agency has to answer. Whether they use 1, 2, or all 8 of those budget cutting strategies. Let me ask what I think is probably a rhetorical question. Anybody's budget in the room increasing? That's what I thought. All right, so if your budget's not increasing, it's either flat, and we all know that flat means decline, right? In real terms, if you're flat, you're declining. Every one of the strategies involves people. Here are the questions you got to answer. How do you deal effectively, humanely, with the people that have to be let go? How do you keep the folks that you need, and perhaps more importantly, how do you keep them motivated and engaged? Not an easy thing these days. How do you determine what your long-term needs are? And then finally, how do you make sure that you're positioned to get those long-term needs? How are you going to stay competitive in the labor market for those critical skills today and tomorrow? So one of the things that the partnership and Booz Allen, and in this case the Federal Chico Council, did about now 6 weeks ago is hold a day-long workshop to answer these 5 questions. Most of the Chico Council was there. We had in excess of 150 people between the morning and the afternoon session. Morning was more strategy, afternoon was more tactical. But I'm going to share the results of those 5 questions with you, but no one claims that all the answers are going to be up here on the PowerPoint slides. So if you have suggestions, by all means, offer them to the group, because these are hard things to do. Okay? In the interest of time, I'm not going to cover every one of these. I'll try to manage the time budget here so that we have a little bit of time left for questions. But first, the most immediate problem. How do you deal with employees who have to be let go? We talked about the pros and cons of VERA and VSIP. RIF as a last resort, but again, it can be surgical. And if you're trying to protect critical skills, if that's part of your core mission, that's an option that you can't take off the table. I really, really like what John Barry has proposed, this new phased retirement option that lets senior folks sort of ease out without suffering an annuity penalty. They've got an interesting, not too complicated formula that I'm sure Steve Losey, our Fed Times reporter in the room, can explain. I've actually taken a stab at explaining it too. We don't need to do that today, but this has been something that the human capital community has been talking about for a long time, phased retirement, to allow senior folks to ease out and make room but still retain that institutional knowledge. So I hope that gets passed and signed. The next 2, job search training, internal, external placement. When you think about this, I'll speak for myself. When I left the federal government after 37 years, I had no clue how to write a private sector resume or how to go about searching for a job outside of government. I knew how to pull the strings in government. I knew who to call and what to write, you know, the competencies and the KSAs. We don't have to do that anymore. But it's an art form, and most people who've competed in the private labor market get it. Most feds haven't had to experience it. So think about providing job search training as you're trying to get people to leave voluntarily as the most preferred option. But let's talk about the last 2. Employees are watching, the people who leave and the people who stay. And we should, for those who have to go, help them depart with dignity. We should celebrate their service. We should congratulate them. We should thank them. Because they're leaving through no fault of their own, whether it's through retirement or resignation or reduction in force. They have served. We should acknowledge it. Some of us go all the way back to the post-Vietnam War era. My first government job was conducting massive RIFs of civilian employees in the Air Force in 1974. And I have to tell you, for both our returning service people and our civilians, this was, we didn't call it that way back then, but this was yet another peace dividend, right? We just let them go. And we can't. And we need to keep them connected with alumni programs. The Army has a great one called a Career Alumni Program, in part because they want to stay and they still want to feel connected to the agency they've, in some cases, worked for decades. But what's another good practical reason for keeping them connected? Yeah, they know stuff. You may need them. A number of agencies actually have what are called reserve corps, made up mostly of reemployed or annuitants who are eligible for reemployment. NSA has a great one because some of the skills they potentially lose through retirement, they've really gotten that down to a science, which you would expect from a place like NSA. Some of my colleagues are here from that world. But keep them connected because you may need them. All right. How do you keep the ones you need? Especially the best and brightest. And how do you keep them engaged? Everybody knows, but few people do, act on survey results. Employees watch. Every agency has its Get Better plan when the best places to work results are issued. Employees watch to see whether agencies put their money where their mouth is. That affects retention. The third bullet down. Do we know, this is another rhetorical question, do we know the single most important factor in an employee's decision to stay or go? Yeah, that first level supervisor. And the partnership in Booz Allen did a study about a year ago now on employee attrition, and we found that in the first 2 years, some agencies were hemorrhaging young talent at the rate of 25 or 30%. And that's because, in no small part, the supervisor relationship. You've got to invest in that. That's easier said than done because you got to make a business case. But you got to make the business case. And I think survey results are one way that you can do that. You got to invest in managerial training, supervisory training. Workspace flexibilities, that's the new term for telework, by the way, where geography becomes less relevant. Think about that strategy when you're closing and consolidating geographies. Your work may be moving, and your talent may not want to move, so what do? Just say, that's life, you stay, we go. These days, you don't have to do that. Again, DoD has honed this to a fine art with base realignment and closure. Because as soon as you announce that you're closing something, what happens? Yeah, they head for the hills. Yet you need to keep performing the mission. And so use workspace flexibilities to do that. And then lastly, this is something that I thought was very interesting from the Chicos. If there was ever a time to make performance distinctions, it's now. Why? If they're doing well, let them know. They don't like it. If everybody's treated equally, and why? Because your highest performers also have the highest attrition risk. Now, there's not a lot of bonus money out there. There may not be any. But we all know that bonuses are just symbolic. There are lots of people work in the government for intrinsic reward, right? So there are lots of intrinsic ways of rewarding your best performers, of acknowledging them, of recognizing them, because at the end of the day, that's your highest attrition risk. You've got to make performance distinctions. And Jerry and Reggie were part of the conversation. They're the next group, and we're running over. So, well, this is going to be a great Chapter 1, Chapter 2, because Reggie in the workshop, Reggie Wells, who's Chico at Social Security, and Jerry Buckles, who's Chico at NASA. Raise your hands back there. This is a plug for your panel. Reggie actually chaired this part of the workshop, and that's one of the conclusions they reached: make performance distinctions. And then keep them engaged. There's nothing harder now than to do that. Everything they read in the paper can help to disengage them, to frustrate them, to make them just sort of turn off. Whether they leave or not, another matter. John Barry has this great term. He uses it in connection with telework, sort of the line of sight, but I think it applies here too. What you don't want is rampant presenteeism. Not absenteeism. Presenteeism means they're at work, but for various reasons, they're not engaged. They're not giving you 100%, and these days that's understandable. How do you do it? I think, again, this sounds trite, but the experience of agencies is that it works. Focus on the mission. This is where senior leadership comes in and says, focus on the mission. Our mission is important. Well, there's lots of debates about the size and role of government. There are very few debates about cutting air traffic controllers or intelligence analysts or doctors in a VA hospital. Most people come to work for an agency for its mission. Keep them focused on mission. Celebrate their service. So while you make performance distinctions, you should also celebrate the fact that people are getting the job done. Part of our challenge here is that American citizens have an expectation of excellence in government service, and they take it for granted. It's expected. No one tells them thank you. We have to tell the folks who stay thank you. And obviously communicate. That sounds trite as well, but those who've been in the chair know that this is not an easy thing, because you got to plan for all sorts of scenarios, including things like sequestration. How candid how should you be when it comes to your sequestration plans? Things that may never come to pass, but you got to plan for those contingencies. On the other hand, we'll talk in a minute, if you don't communicate, what happens? They make up the answers. They'll fill in the gaps. So you got to tell them as much as you can. You got to be candid, and frankly, you got to tell them what you can't tell them. We're planning for this stuff. Rest assured, we're going to do everything we can to minimize impact, but we don't want you to panic because we don't know whether it's going to happen. So, again, that takes leaders who are willing to stand up in rooms like this in front of employees and be as transparent as they can. And then lastly, a safety net. Tell them, this is what we did in DOD. We lopped off about over 300,000 jobs. We only had to RIF about 12,000 people. We were all very proud of that. And we told folks we're going to do everything we can to A, retain you, or B, retrain you, or C, place you somewhere else in the department, or D, help you find a job elsewhere. Everything we can, and we put our money where our mouth was. You got to do that. If they know they got a safety net, they'll get back focused on the mission. And then you got to think long term. Again, no easy thing. Most agencies have 1 or 2 year budgets. DOD is lucky. It has 5 years. Other agencies have somewhere in between, but that takes special congressional dispensation. You got to get everybody in the organization, including and especially senior leaders, thinking 3 to 5 years downstream. Look at the consequences of what you do today over time. Why? How long does it take to develop an air traffic controller? Or a VA nurse? Or an anesthetist? See, I said that. Or an intelligence analyst? Or an IRS auditor? If you're not thinking 3 to 5 years downstream, if you're not thinking, what are my critical skills, and planning now for them, you're already behind the curve. Because many government jobs are difficult to hire at mid-career levels. You have to hire at the entry level, and you have to train. And if you got to get the crystal ball out and look downstream, because as I said, there are some jobs that take long enough to develop that if you're not preparing the pipeline today for those future jobs, especially supervisors, managers, and executives, you're already behind the curve. And then lastly, how do you make sure you're going to be able to get them? Has anyone been to a college campus recruiting for your agency lately? Yes, ma'am. You know, again, it's easy to get lulled into a false sense of security because, like most employers, if government hangs out the help wanted sign, people line up around the block. That's not always the case for those very, very critical skills like STEM skills, where the labor market is always going to be competitive. And that line around the block is temporary. I already mentioned the alarming statistic of that early year attrition that we discovered. We need to revisit that report. I'd like to see whether that still continues to this day in federal agencies. But even when you can hire them, it doesn't mean they're going to stay with you. Some of the other things that agencies have done where they're not hiring in droves, they're not hiring at all, is to still maintain a presence. IRS, we used to send our senior auditors out to lecture at business schools and establish relationships with professors because professors identify their best students and are in a position to steer them in particular directions. That's how I got my first government job. I had a labor law professor who told me, you really ought to go work doing labor relations in the government. I never would have even thought of it, but for that advice. So maintaining a presence on campus, whether you're hiring or not, so that when you can start hiring and or when the labor market gets more competitive, you'll be in a position to do that. I'd really be interested in hearing Jerry and Reggie talk about that in their panel. And then lastly, think about recruiting upstream. Again, this is something that most federal agencies don't do very well. Recruit at the sophomore, junior level. At the very least, recruit in the fall of the senior year. We've learned how to do that, but this is even further upstream. And there are all sorts of really neat tools that I believe are underutilized for finding talent early, getting your hooks into them, not to be too crass about it, showing them the kinds of things they could do in your agency, letting them play with some of the really cool toys that our agencies have, whether it's cooperative education, SCEP. I think SCEP is called something else now, but Pathways, it's part of Pathways. I have SCEP. Yeah, it's coming soon to a theater near you, right? There are all sorts of intern programs. We don't necessarily call them intern programs anymore. When I was at OPM, we changed the Presidential Management Fellows intern program to fellows. We all know why, right? Okay. There are lots of scholarship authorities that, again, most agencies don't know about or use. And what happens when you recruit upstream? When they spend summers with you and get to know you, then you're going to be able to land them no matter how competitive the labor market is. All right, so here's the bottom line. Every smart strategy is going to affect the workforce. So that means that the questions we just went through need to be asked every day at the most senior agency levels and down through the ranks. You got to communicate because, as several of you have already noted, rumors become truth. They'll fill in the blanks. You've got to be candid, and that includes telling the employees what you can tell them and also being candid about telling them what you can't tell them. Because otherwise, we've all played the game where somebody says something to the coworker and he or she repeats it, and you go around the room, and by the time it gets through 20 or 30 people, it's unrecognizable from the first statement, and those things can run rampant in a workforce. Don't take riff off the table. This is a case where it sometimes does the least harm. Again, VEER and VSIP are great, but you have no control over who goes. You can target it. You can say only these people are eligible for VEER or VSIP, but even there, people get to decide, and we already suggested that your top folks are the ones that have the most options. In IRS, IRS ran a RIF in 1995, and the workforce was still talking about it in 2001. These things take a long time to heal. And so we need to take that into account. And programs that help employees heal, the survivors heal. There is survivor guilt, so we need to take that into account, whether it's the result of a RIF or just downsizing where you freeze hiring and incent people to leave. People still feel guilty about surviving, so you have to be able to deal with it. And then again, I've said this before, I'll belabor the point, especially now. Somebody's got to celebrate their service. And it needs to be agencies, it needs to be senior leaders, it needs to be executives and managers, thanking people for the job they're doing or the job they've done as they may leave, keeping them focused on the mission, keeping them engaged, because, again, there's still the expectation of excellence. That's not going to go away. So I apologize for taking almost a full 30 minutes. I appreciate your time and attention. We have a few minutes for some questions, so anybody. So I talked at 78 RPM. I show right at 10, so thank you all very much.